Today it's all about turning dirt to soil and building lush perennial pastures with Gabe Brown coming up. Welcome to Grassfed Life. I'm your host, Diego, D-I-E-G-O. Thanks for listening to the special edition of the podcast today. This is a new episode airing at night on Wednesday, an unexpected time. This episode is part of the launch of the brand new Grassfed Life Insider. If you're not familiar with the Insider, go back one episode and listen to the episode that Darby and I published on Monday, talking all about the Insider. But if you don't have time to go back and listen to the Insider, here's what it is in a nutshell. The Grassfed Life Insider gives you access to exclusive premium content every single week of the year for just $5 a month. Shortly, a lot of the podcast episodes are going to go into the Insider, meaning if you want to hear them, you have to be a member of the Insider. We're putting a lot of resources in there, from small courses to master classes to videos to podcasts. Find out everything that's involved at grassfedlife.co/insider. Ultimately, the goal for the Insider is to fund more content creation. Content like you're going to hear today from experts who are really well known in one sector of the regenerative agriculture movement. We want to do more and more with these types of experts, but these experts aren't going to do this for free. And we want to be able to provide resources to people at a very economic price, $5 a month. So in order to provide those resources, we have to work with experts to create them. People like you're going to hear today, Gabe Brown. Now, Gabe's not going to dedicate his time for free to help you. He's a busy guy, as you'll hear in this episode. But he will create some resources and take some time if he's getting compensated for his time to create those resources. That's where the Grassfed Life Insider comes in. That's where you come in. As an insider, you partner with us in the continued creation of brand new, expanded premium content at a very, very low price. So as you listen to this episode today with Gabe Brown, think about if you'd like to hear more from Gabe. Think about if you'd like to see a mini course with Gabe. If you would, then you're the one who can help make that possible by becoming an insider at grassfedlife.co/insider. Moving to today's episode, as I've said many times, it's with author, farmer Gabe Brown. Gabe has a brand new book, Dirt to Soil. I suggest you check it out if you're into grazing, cover cropping, the regenerative agriculture movement. He knows his stuff, and he's really well known in this sector for what he does. No-till, cover crops, grazing on big land. Today, you're going to get a small taste of all those things. So let's jump right into it. Thoughts on building lush perennial pastures with farmer Gabe Brown. So Gabe, you recently published a new book, Dirt to Soil. Some people might be familiar with you by name. When it comes to no-till, grazing, growing in a no-till system, what would you say you're most known for? Or what would you like to be most known for?
Well, thank you, Diego. It's a pleasure to be with you. I just am a person who didn't grow up on a farm or ranch and had the good fortune of going down this path. And so because I wasn't from a farm or ranch, I didn't have any preconceived notions. And so I'm willing to try a lot of things. I was willing to try a lot of things and still am. And so I was always kind of pushing the limits, so to speak, trying, cover crops when cover crops weren't cool, and integrating livestock onto cropland when not many were really doing that, and then pushing the boundaries as far as running higher stock densities. And so I guess I'm probably more known for the cover crop portion of it, but my passion really lies in producing and raising livestock is what I enjoy doing.
A lot of people are resilient to try new things, take on new ideas, and it's becoming more and more acceptable now with more information out there. You give a lot of talks, you have a book, you're one of the people putting ideas out there. What was your initial idea behind trying something that, as you said, wasn't cool at the time? Was it, I see the science here, I think it works, it makes sense intuitively to me, I'm going to go for it? Was that as simple as that?
Well, originally, one of the first things I tried was no-till. And at the time moved into no-till in 1994, there was a few people trying it, but it wasn't it wasn't a widely accepted practice here in the upper Midwest. And I looked at it from the standpoint, boy, it's going to save me moisture and it's going to save me time. And those two things are always in short supply here in Northern Plains and for farmers in general. And so it just made sense to me. So I tried it. Now, the cover cropping aspect come about from, I had the good fortune, I tell people it at the time it wasn't a good fortune, but I had 3 years of hail and 1 year of drought right in a row, 4 years of crop failure. So out of necessity, I needed to figure out how can I make my soils productive without all the expensive synthetic inputs. And so I was forced to try cover crops and this crop diversity and integrating livestock onto cropland simply out of financial necessity. And that kind of is the driving factor in many situations. People wait until they're in dire need of change before they actually make a change. Now my wife and son and I have a saying, we want to fail at several things every year, because if we don't fail at things, we're not trying enough new things. And so now I do it for the sheer joy of knowing that it'll take my operation to another level. Back then, though, it was out of necessity.
I was listening to one of your talks, and in one of them, you used the phrase, we create our own droughts. And I think it ties into, when you said, moisture was important, a drought made you need to change. When you say we create our own droughts, what does that mean?
We as producers do not realize that I like to call it stewardship, others may call it management, has a lot to do with what we do to the landscape. In other words, our decisions as to are we growing a cover crop, how much can we influence water infiltration, how much can we influence water holding capacity of our soils? The answer to that is we can influence it greatly by the practices that we apply on our own farm or ranch. And let me give you an example here. I was in California a few years ago and touring a ranch, and on that particular ranch, they had been coping with several years of drought. And I finally asked the owner of the ranch, I said, well, how much precipitation have you had? Well, we've only had 32 inches this year. And I'm going, 32 inches, that's several years worth for us here in the Northern Plains. But the fact of the matter is, they had overgrazed their ranch for so many years that they had actually destroyed the aggregation in their soils, where they were not able to infiltrate the rainfall that they did get. And then due to lack of organic matter in the soils, which was also directly related to improper grazing, they were not able to store what water they could infiltrate. So in those regards, we create our own drought by applying those practices which can improve soil aggregation, increase the amount of carbon, thus increasing the water holding capacity in our soils. We can then make our operations very resilient to these wide fluctuations in both temperature and precipitation. So we as producers have a major influence in the ability of our operations to be more resilient to drought.
Working at this for 25 years with the no-till, with cover cropping, if you hadn't done those things, what would your operation look like today? Would you be able to do what you do on the farm if you had been doing this conventionally?
No, that's a great question. And no, I couldn't. I look back and I tell people, I so wish I would have had the foresight to archive some of our soils, take more pictures, archive the soils so that we could now go back and look at the pictures, and we could apply some of the modern soil testing techniques to those archived soils and look at the changes that we've made and the changes in the soil, the ability of the soil to infiltrate water, the ability to store water, and then the amount of biology in the soil, how much more nutrients we're cycling today versus what we were 25 years ago. The changes are just tremendous. Now, we are doing some things on our operation where I'm involved with a company called Landstream, where we're taking and doing very in-depth soil analysis to look at our soils now. And for instance, Dr. John Norman has documented that we now have the equivalent of 96 tons of carbon per acre stored in our soils, which is about 5 times the amount that are seen in many of the soils in the area. So we're making tremendous change. I just didn't know what it was when I started 25 years ago. And this all leads to an operation now that well, I'll give you this example. When my wife and I bought this operation in 1991, this ranch, we were able to run about 65 cow-calf pairs and about 20 yearlings. Well, on basically the same acres today, we're running over 1,000 head of beef animals. That's how much more productive this operation has become. And besides the beef cattle, we raise grass-finished lamb, pastured pork. We got 1,400 laying hens out on pasture. We're producing vegetables and honey and all these cash crops. And we've got a orchard started now. And we're stacking all these enterprises onto the same land base. And so we're much, much more productive as compared to 25 years ago.
When you look at that increase in stocking density and or your carrying capacity of that land base, I think sometimes that gets lost in translation. What is it that allows you to put that many more animals on the same amount of land? Is it more forage for longer? Is it better forage? Is it forage that grows more, regenerates faster? All of the above?
It's definitely all of the above. Back in my early years, I remember we would feed hay for about 6 months out of the year. Now we're feeding hay for about 60 to 75 days out of the entire year. Our livestock are out grazing through the winter. And because of our adaptive grazing practices, it allows greater recovery time to the pasture. And that, of course, increases and advances the health of not only both the soil, but of the plants also. We have a tremendous amount of diversity of grasses, forbs, and legumes in our paddocks. All of these things add together to be able to allow us to run many more, not only head, but different species of livestock also.
A lot of people listening to this, they're looking to do some form of grazing. Cattle, sheep, pastured poultry, that's probably the primary audience for people listening to this. And a lot of those people, they have, say, families that were involved in traditional row crop production, and they want to go from row crop to pasture, or they're able to acquire row crop land or lease row crop land relatively inexpensively, but they need pasture to grow on. This is a very common theme question that comes up. If somebody was going to take over row crop land, they didn't want to grow crops on it. They want to graze on it, and they're there for the long term. what would you get them to think about, or what would you start advising them to do to move it from burned out soybean field to eventually something that is perennial and regenerative and adding organic matter, storing carbon?
Sure. And I use this analogy for that situation. Look at when a highway department comes and builds a road. What's the first thing that grows alongside that road? Well, the first thing is you have your annual forbs. Many people call them weeds. And these weeds grow. They're a plant collecting sunlight through photosynthesis, pumping those all those compounds out into the soil to attract biology. Then what happens? You get annual grasses coming. Then a year or two later, then you start getting some perennials, grasses and forbs and legumes coming. Well, we want to do the same thing with this degraded cropland. So I tell people one of the biggest mistakes I ever made was I took land that had been farmed with heavy tillage, heavy synthetics, fertilizers, and I seeded it all back to perennials in 1 year. I got a beautiful stand as far as the number of plants out there, but it was not productive. I did not address the soil health concerns first. And that's what's happening in that roadside analogy. The first thing that comes is those annual forbs or weeds. They're nature's healers. They're nature's scabs. They're there to start pumping root exudates into the soil, to start breaking up compaction layers, to start feeding biology. So what we need to do in our situation with the cropland that we want to convert back to perennials is we should be going in there with very diverse cover crop mixes to start. And I recommend to people that for a period of 2 years, they seed diverse mixes of cover crops, trying to get as much diversity as they can onto that landscape. Now, we bring the livestock in to graze those cover crops, but we're not going to graze it down to the ground. We're going to leave plenty of residue or armor, plant residue on that soil surface to protect that soil, protect it from wind erosion, water erosion, evaporation. That helps the biology underneath that residue in the soil to start cycling nutrients. So it's a process. We're going to take a couple years to start to regenerate these soils, jumpstart nutrient cycling, jumpstart the water cycle, the mineral cycle, and to get that soil moving in the direction needed so that once we go in there, the third year or so and seed our perennials, we're going to get a very good stand of perennials. We're going to have the nutrient cycling so they will be productive. Then it's all a matter of proper management of the livestock to enhance that system further.
When it comes to cover crops, people are going to say, well, how do I choose? Is a cover crop and you just want a mix? You get what's adapted locally and run with it? Or are you going to be pretty nitpicky and specific and really dig into, okay, this is exactly the recipe I want?
Well, realize that all species of plants are influenced greatly by the conditions that year. The amount of sunshine, the amount of moisture, the amount of dew, humidity, all these things come into play. So each year, there's going to be a little bit of difference as to which plant species performs the best. So that's one of the reasons diversity is always good. Now, I tell people to do your homework. Find out the species that are adapted and can be grown in your local environment. And sometimes this takes experimentation on our part. And I tell people, I've seen many times where one producer has good luck with a certain species of cover crop, and maybe only 10 miles away, 20 miles away, another producer can try that same species and it just doesn't fit in those soil types. So there's going to be some trial and error there. In saying that, there's a lot of good data out there that shows that, well, you're in this type of a Mediterranean type environment. We know these warm season species, such as sorghum, sudan grass, and cowpeas, for instance, mung beans, guar, they're going to work in that type of an environment. So you start with those and then you experiment as to the others. It's also going to depend on what's your resource concern. What are you trying to do on this particular field? And, maybe there's hard pan areas and you really need to break up those hard pan areas. Maybe you don't have a lot of soil aggregates and you need to start building soil aggregates. Well, in that case, you're going to go with very fibrous root systems. In other words, the grasses. So producers need to do their homework and understand resource concerns, understand what the species of covers each has to offer, and then go from there. And I encourage them to seek out producers in the area who have grown covers and learn from them. Find out what they are using, what works, what doesn't, and then use that as your base and build from there.
What are your thoughts with introducing cover crops to perennial pastures that might have a resource concern with them? Maybe they, certain areas just don't drain well. What are your thoughts on no-till drilling into a perennial pasture with annuals that can correct problems?
A lot of people are familiar with Colin's Sice from Australia, and I've been on Colin's place in Australia a number of times and are very familiar with his situation. Colin was known for his no-kill cropping, in which he has perennial paddocks of a variety of different species. They're predominantly warm season species. As temperatures start declining and going down and these warm season species go dormant, he's able to go in there and seed annual cool season species such as oats or barley or canola or a diverse brassica cover crop mix and get them established. It takes the right environment to be able to do that. You need a very long growing season, of which, the southern U.S. would certainly fit and be able to do. And you also, though, need paddocks that are predominantly either warm season or, in the case of an environment further north, more cool season that shut down at a time. Because otherwise, those perennial root systems that are in the soil, they're not going to give the opportunity for that other species, that cover crop, to germinate and grow. And so it takes a specific environment in order to be able to do that. What we recommend, and I recommend as well consult, is I would rather see that approached from a perennial standpoint. In other words, let's have our perennial pastures or paddocks. Let's go in there and see if through grazing management, we can stimulate the latent seed bank to germinate those species which will address that issue. Or we can go in there at such a time and try and interseed perennial species that will have a long-term effect to address that resource concern.
I mean, in general, do you just let nature run its course? Is most of the seeding done at the front end of a long time scale, and then through grazing management, whatever perennials are in the seed bank, whatever perennials are migrate in via animals and wants to grow, that's what grows? Or do you go in there periodically and add species that you'd like to see?
Realize that in my location where I'm at in the Northern Plains, we have a lot of quote unquote true native range. And by that, I mean, it's land that to our knowledge has never been tilled. Much of it cannot be, tilled or disturbed or seeded into simply because of the slope of the land, the number of rocks on it, the terrain. It just is not conducive to taking equipment into. In those situations, I would much rather see us use livestock as a tool, and livestock are a tool to go in there and through higher stock density and through varying stock densities and varying the amount of recovery time, we can stimulate that latent seed bank to come. Now, if you're in areas of the country where the majority of land has at one time been tilled, then we may want to go in there and seed perennials in order to get the system going, produce some biomass, have something there to graze. Now, I have seen many producers who just take those cropland areas and allow them weeds to grow and then graze them with livestock. And through proper grazing management, they're able to stimulate that latent seed bank and get a very good stand of diverse perennials. But realize the ecosystems are always changing. Plant species are always changing. It mystifies me why so many people insist, oh, you're in this type of an ecological site description, these species should be growing there. Who are we to say that? Past history might have shown that they commonly do, but things are always changing, the amount of moisture we receive, the days of sunshine, etc. Different species are going to proliferate under certain conditions. What my son and I like to say on our operation is that we're going to allow nature to dictate. And if an animal will eat a plant and receives nutrition from it, it's not a weed, it's a forage. So who are we to say something's a weed, something isn't, something's good, something's bad? What we've found is there are very, very few plants out there that livestock will not eat and will not receive nutrition from. So why not take advantage of them and let nature dictate what is there?
I mean, there's some examples of weeds growing on your land that maybe less broad-minded grazers would look at as a nuisance versus an asset?
That's right. And in my environment, Canada thistle and absinthe wormwood are two of the perennial species that many consider noxious weeds and they just want to get rid of. But if you take a refractometer and you test the Brix level of those plants, they're extremely high. And our cattle and sheep will eat them readily. Our hogs will dig in the soil and eat the roots of those plants. And so we're going to use livestock to try and keep those certain species so they do not go to seed, because obviously we want to be good neighbors, and our neighbors who are grain farmers look at those strictly as weeds. But at the same token, our animals are receiving nutrition from them. So I'm not going to go out there and use chemicals to try and terminate those species.
Earlier, you mentioned using livestock stocking density to, in raising it or lowering it, to encourage certain species to grow. Can you walk through kind of the mechanics of how that would work? How could putting more animals on a piece of land or less encourage one thing over the other at a given time of year?
So what we're trying to do, and I use the analogy of the bison moving across the plains, and there was bison in California and bison out on the East Coast also. But so often the northern plains are associated with these large herds pushed by the predators, and they will graze an area and trample it and get all the dung and urine on it, and the wolves and predators would keep them moving. And then they may not come back to an area for a year or maybe 2 years. Well, that's how it should be with a grazing system on our own operations. we should be very adaptive. And we need to, my friend Dr. Alan Williams always says that we need to do all of these things some of the time and none of them all the time. In other words, we need to be very adaptive and not get into a rut, because nature, just through how these ecosystems evolved, it was never constant. You know, those herds of bison coming across the plains were different in number. It was different timing every year. They stayed for different periods of time. That's how we should be in our grazing management also. And what that does, that stimulates certain species. For instance, here in the northern plains where I'm at, we're predominantly cool season. In other words, the majority of grasses, forbs, legumes that we have growing are cool seasons. However, there's a warm season component, such as big blue stem. And big blue stem is a very productive grass that if we get moisture in July and we do not have livestock on a particular paddock, the big blue stem is going to proliferate and grow. And we need to make sure that some of our paddocks then are not being grazed at that time of the year in order to enhance that particular species, big blue stem. Now, obviously, the cattle and other species of livestock have to be somewhere. But as we move them around paddock to paddock and do not graze the same paddock at the same time every year with the same species, that's going to allow for more diversity. And so that's what I mean, that we have to vary stock densities, recovery times, and the species we use.
With pastures evolving constantly, if they're perennial, how, as a grazer, do you know if there's a problem? Is perennial evolving on its own good enough? Or is there certain testing or things you're looking for to say, hey, I do want to push this. I want to get some of these other species in here?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I will use my own operation as an example. Our ranch is not contiguous, meaning it all isn't adjacent to another parcel. So because of that, at times we may have the majority of our livestock on a different area of the ranch, and we're not able to come back easily graze a particular area because it means moving the livestock a greater distance and across land that we do not own. I went for a period of about 3 years. We only had the livestock back on these certain paddocks very briefly, but the majority of time was spent on other areas. Well, what I saw, because I did not have enough animal impact in livestock grazing, we had some species proliferate that are some might consider invasive. They tend to dominate the paddock. In this case, it was Kentucky bluegrass. Well, what happens then, Kentucky bluegrass is really only palatable and highly nutritious to livestock for just a matter of a few weeks every year. But then it grows up once it starts going to seed. It becomes unpalatable. Livestock don't want to graze it. You get all this residue building up, and that inhibits other species from growing. So what we needed to do was bring large number of livestock onto these paddocks at such a time where they would graze it down and trample all that plant residue that was standing from previous year's growth onto the soil surface where it could be cycled through by biology. And then also the sunlight would be able to get in and would some of these other species then would be able to grow. So that's using livestock as a tool then to help enhance the diversity of a paddock.
In one of your talks, you mentioned that for part of the year, and you said this earlier too, that you're feeding hay, but you don't grow hay on your own land. Is that still the case? And if so, why not?
Well, we will put up some hay on our own land, but if we do that, we're going to feed it where it was put up. We don't want to remove it from one field and take it to another location. We want to keep that carbon on the land. What we prefer to do, though, is I prefer to do what I call importing nutrients. In other words, I rent other land, and then we'll put up some hay, or we purchase hay from other producers and import the nutrients onto our land. And then what we do is we set those bales of hay out onto perennial pastures, and we do what's called bale grazing. We allow the animals to have access to a certain number of bales for a certain time. They consume the majority of it. The rest stays there as carbon on the soil, and biology will cycle those nutrients through. We do not bale graze on the same paddock every year. We're gonna move to a different paddock, and we're moving the cattle weekly while they're bale grazing, but then year to year we're bale grazing on different paddocks. So we're importing carbon onto those areas where we want to add carbon to the system.
For the hay that you produce on land that you rent, are you approaching growing hay the same way you would with growing pasture, diversity of species, variety, that type of thing?
That's a very good question and a very important one. Back when I was in the conventional mindset, I did not have the knowledge to know the importance of all these different plant secondary metabolites and what's really happening in a plant and the nutrition that both livestock and humans need. It's more than just protein and calcium and phosphorus. It's all these other things. And I remember for years, I used to just put up alfalfa and along with smooth brome grass. That was the hay. Now what we're doing, we will, and I should back up just a moment. When I go to rent property and realize I'm located adjacent to the city of Bismarck, 100,000 people, and city's expanding pretty rapidly. So I'll go into areas that I know will be sold for housing developments in the future. If I can get a 3 to 5 year lease on some of that crop ground, I will seed it to cover crops for a year. We'll graze livestock on it if possible. Then I will seed a very, very diverse mix of grasses, forbs, and legumes. And I want, there is no magical number, but I prefer at least 3 of each of those species in the mix. And then that way there's different root types, different rooting depths, different seasons where those species proliferate. And then when we're putting up hay off those, we're actually giving our livestock a much more diverse diet. And then if those livestock become human nutrition or are harvested for meat, that in turn will be passed on to us, those who are consuming that meat. And we will actually have a much, much more diverse array of nutrients that we're able to get from those products. I think that's really important too. Consumers are sourcing grass-finished proteins. If you look and you're going to buy, say, some grass-finished beef hamburger, well, what was that animal fed? Was that animal fed a very, very diverse diet? So it had all of these plant secondary metabolites and all these other nutrients available to it? Or was it fed a very limited diet where there was only a handful of species of plants? Well, as a consumer, we should be looking to source our proteins from producers whose animals are fed a very, very diverse diet, because then it'll allow us to be able to consume a much wider array of nutrients.
When you think hay, there's some people out there like a Jim Garish who advocate and kind of talk about going hayless. You're somebody who I'd say is at the pinnacle of growing pasture, building soil. Have you tried going hayless, and what are your thoughts of it? I mean, if anybody's going to make it work, I'd think, with deep soils, established pastures like you have, does it make sense?
Oh, yeah. Of course it makes sense from a profitability standpoint for the producers. And I get often asked that question, and I answer it this way. If my land was contiguous altogether, most years I could graze my livestock year round. Realize, though, we get 75 inches of snowfall a year. There's some years that it's just physically impossible for our livestock to dig through that much snow to be able to forage. It's for those times that I have a supply of hay on hand. Now, some might say, well, that just means you shouldn't be running cattle during the winter or sheep or hogs in the northern plains. Well, that's another whole argument, Now, the reason we aren't able to go quite year round with our grazing is, as I said, our ranch is not contiguous. There's actually housing developments in between my home place and other areas of the ranch. You don't want your livestock on the other side of a housing development when a blizzard comes up. And here in the northern plains, we get those fairly often because you don't want a neighbor calling saying there's 100 head of cattle underneath the deck of his house. That's not a good phone call to get. So it's easier for us to just bite the bullet, so to speak. Let's move the livestock to where they're protected and they're not going to travel in a blizzard. And then let's just feed them hay for that short amount of time. But from a sheer cost standpoint, I mentioned earlier how when I first started, we were feeding hay 6 months out of the year, and now we're down to approximately 2 months. Well, that's a big change. That's a lot of dollar savings in our pocket.
You're working long-term to build a legacy in a few ways through your knowledge, which other people take and implement on their land, and through your home base, your ranch. With the city expanding there, how do you preserve the work that you've done into the future? This is a topic I think about a lot. It's a topic that comes up somewhat in questioning. When you dedicate your life to building soil, what have you done to say, I'd like this to keep going and not turn into track homes?
Yeah, that's a very good question. One that I think of often, and we actually have done several steps, moved down that path to ensure that it is going to continue. The first thing my wife and I did, we put all of our land in a living trust, and we have a son and a daughter, and our son is the executor and the recipient of that trust. So he knows and that this land will be his. And now, as far as can we keep anyone from slapping eminent domain on it and saying, oh, this is going to become a landfill? There's no way to do that. There's just no way for us to be able. You can say you're putting your land in an easement that will not allow that, but in North Dakota, where I live, there is a statute that any easements can only be 99 years in length. And so for that reason, many of the foundations out there that provide these easements will not work in North Dakota because there is that statute on the books. So all I can do to guarantee that is bring our children up in the way that they have the mindset that this is a legacy, and there is zero doubt in my mind that my son is not going to keep this land in production agriculture. Now, as he says, at some point in time, it may be surrounded by houses, but it's going to be the most beautiful park inside that housing development that anyone's ever seen. And that's one of the reasons we're moving down the path. I mentioned in my book how we've seeded a lot of fruit trees and nut trees, and my wife and I have planted over 20,000 trees on our property. Is we're moving into a more perennial permaculture-based system as compared to the annual cropping system that we once did. And you can only take care of what you have control of. Beyond that, you have to leave it up to the next generation and try and instill in them the beliefs that you had. And they're going to use their best judgment and move forward from there.
Yeah, I think it's really well said. And I think a big part of your work will live on through people that aren't tied to you by blood, who get inspired to take it on and do it. A lot of people listening to this, I would say, are on the smaller livestock side. Like, they would hear your numbers of how many animals you have, 1,400 laying hens, 1,000 head of cattle, sheep, pigs, and that seems humongous to what they're doing. One challenge that I see in this sector on the regenerative side can be scaling. What have you done on the marketing side to move the eggs from 1,400 layers to sell all that beef? How have you found doing that at scale without having to go the route of commodity producer and just sell at commodity price?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And first thing I tell people, they shouldn't mimic what we're doing. Everyone has their own resource base, their own goals for their family and their operation. We're at a little bit larger scale than many simply because of where we're located and the land base that we do have. Now, what we've done to market that, and I give my son all the credit for this, is the last figures I heard, the average return per food dollar to the farmer is about 12.6 cents. Well, there's no business that can stay in operation with that kind of return. So as a producer, one of the things we started to do many years ago was, how do we get a larger share, in other words, of that food dollar? Well, you market higher up the chain. So my options were to, as you said, sell it as a commodity, or I could sell it a little higher up the chain to someone who is will pay more for a value-added product, or we could sell directly to the consumer. So what we've done is we try and market as much as we can to the end user, the consumer. So my son set up a web page, and he uses Seven Sons Farms Graze Cart program, and we have on that website where you can go on there, and right now we have over 120 different cuts of beef, lamb, pork, eggs, and that's not counting all the vegetables we have in season to sell. And you can order online, and then we can ship it either directly to the door, or we have drop points around the state of North Dakota where we're doing 1 or 2 deliveries per month to different cities. Now, one of the challenges we had to jump through first, and it's a challenge for many if they're direct marketing proteins, is where are you going to get that animal processed at? And in North Dakota, there was only 3 facilities that were approved for slaughter, where then you could retail the product. Well, the waiting list to get an animal harvested was 13 months. So a group of us got together and we actually built a slaughter facility. And it's been up and running for almost 5 years now. And it's a standalone facility. We pay the same as anyone else to get animals processed there. But we do have a standing date where every third week my son is taking animals to that facility to be harvested, and then we bring the products back, and they're all cut into individual packages, steaks, roast, burger, etc. And that's what we're marketing direct to the consumers. It allows us greater profitability. There is a lot of work involved, and which is a challenge in and of itself. But there's a really good feeling that comes about from marketing what you're producing directly to the consumer. And I tell people it's because of that we're going to be profitable every year. And the way we are profitable every year is because we're not going to sell things for lower than our cost of production. So the beauty of that is directly marketing to consumers is that we know what it costs us to produce, a dozen eggs, for example. We're not going to sell them at a loss. Thus, we're profitable every year, which takes us out of all of these worries about the commodity markets. And another thing I'm very proud of is that we're doing this without any government subsidies. We refuse to take part in any government programs. And I think some of those may have a place as producers are starting out. But once I get into that, I should not be subsidized by the urban public for me to make a living. By that, I mean, I shouldn't have to rely on these government programs in order to make a profit and stay in business. We're not giving Ma and Pa's restaurant on Main Street a subsidy. Why should we as producers be subsidized?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I'm looking at the site, and you have the common approach I think a lot of people have is you are marketing to the customers, offering a lot of variety. Your pricing looks very reasonable, I think, from the uninitiated consumer. Like, you're not selling ground beef for $15 a pound, and it looks very affordable. One question I have on the shipping, how has that worked for you?
Well, realize that the slaughter facility that we built is only state inspected, which means any of the meat products that we have harvested through that facility can only be sold in North Dakota. Now, because we're at such scale, particularly with our beef herd, we are having the numbers of those processed in semi-load lots at a USDA inspected facility. So we are able to ship those products nationwide. Our goal is to someday be able to sell it all locally within a 25-mile radius of our operation. North Dakota, though, only has a little over 700,000 people in the entire state. So theoretically, there's plenty of people here to consume our product, but it's just a matter of getting the word out and getting them to try our product and getting them to why they should eat products that are produced in a regenerative manner. We are trying to do the majority of our business locally, though.
Love the idea of that. And for what you're doing, you have the track record, you have the results, and it's very visual. When I'm sure you can drive around in an hour radius and find neighbors who would look at what you're doing and say, nope, not for me. What's a common reason why not? Like, what are the objections to why people won't do what you do? Is there a downside? Is it just a longer payoff period? If you're getting all these results, why wouldn't you do it?
I do quite a bit of private consulting. I'm part of a group with Ray Archuleta, Dr. Alan Williams, and David Brandt, soil health consultants. And as we travel around North America consulting, what we find, there's an old adage that goes, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And the issue becomes, I often get asked this, why don't if this is so great, why don't more people do it? Well, there's several reasons. Number one is they're unfamiliar with it. And a lot of people are hesitant to change. And you mentioned that earlier, how some people are scared to try a cover crop. Other people jump in, with both feet. Well, they're hesitant to change. Another reason is peer pressure. When I started no-tilling, my father-in-law, who owned this place before my wife and I purchased it, he did not like the looks of those no-till fields. He said they looked terrible. He wanted a nice black field when you started out in the spring. Peer pressure is, in some communities, is very, very strong, and it prevents people from going down this path. Another reason, and I say this is the most antagonistic thing out there to the move to regenerative agriculture, is the current USDA farm program. The current farm program, and in particular, the way revenue insurance for farmers is through that farm program, dictates what producers are going to seed or plant every year. Because with margins the way they are in the current commoditized, industrialized mindset, margins are very small, very thin, and the bankers, they're going to tell producers, we're not going to loan you money unless you take part in revenue insurance, so we are guaranteed that amount of money back. So producers take part in that, and they're stuck into that mindset of not trying these new things, not moving down the regenerative path. Usually the producers that we get coming to us, looking to us to move down the regenerative path, are those that are either financially no longer able to secure funding, and so they're looking for another way. How am I going to make my operation profitable? So they come to us looking for answers. Or it's a percentage of producers who just know that the current production model is wrong. They're not doing the right thing. They see the degradation on their landscape, in their soils. They don't feel right going out there spraying all these chemicals and herbicides and fungicides and those things. So they're looking for another avenue. Those are the producers that we get moving into regenerative agriculture. Now, fortunately, there's a real movement on there now. It started with soil health and cover crops, and now it's being called regenerative ag. And, it's a groundswell effort. You can't hardly pick up a farm magazine nowadays, without there being some article in there on regenerative agriculture. So for those of us who have been going down the path a long time, it's really refreshing to see that the snowball is finally rolling downhill, so to speak.
That's it. It's rolling. It's got momentum. It's moving forward. You're one of the people that put those initial first flakes onto the ball and help pack it and give it a push downhill. Your book, Dirt to Soil, recently published by Chelsea Green. People can pick it up anywhere books are sold. Who's that book for? What do you want people to get out of it at the end of the day?
I get asked why I wrote this book, and I tell people, Chelsea Green asked me to share my story, and I wrote it because I just wanted to give people hope, to show them that, hey, if a kid who grew up in town and became a farmer and rancher can go down this path and be successful and truly make a difference on this operation to the land, the soil, the ecosystem, and now to human health as consumers eat these products that we're producing, anyone can do this. So I just wanted to give people hope and show them that, yes, this can be done, and it can be done anywhere in the world where there's production agriculture.
Love the idea of that. So Dirt to Soil, people can check that out. You also do a lot of talks. You do consulting. For people that want to follow along with you, find out everything that you have going on or get in touch, where's the best place to go to find out about everything Gabe Brown?
Sure. There's two places, either brownsranch.us or soilhealthconsultants.com.
All right. Thanks for taking the time to chat today, Gabe. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. Appreciate it.
There you have it, a special edition of the podcast with farmer and author Gabe Brown. If you enjoyed this and you want to learn more, be sure to check out Gabe's book, Dirt to Soil, available everywhere that books are sold or on Amazon, where everybody buys everything these days. You can also check out some of the resources that Gabe Brown has at the link listed below in the show notes for this episode. And if you enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more episodes like it, or if you enjoyed this episode and you want to go more in depth with people like Gabe Brown, then consider partnering with us at Grassfed Life to create that content, to create more content and more in-depth content. You can partner with us very easily at grassfedlife.co/insider. For $5 a month, we're going to give you brand new premium weekly content year-round. That content's going to be podcasts, mini courses, master classes, videos. We want to raise the bar in terms of the content that's out there and easily accessible. The more people that support us, the more resources that we have to make more and better content. So consider partnering with us, gaining access to an exclusive, ever-growing library, and become a part of a community. Learn more about the Insider at grassfedlife.co/insider. That's all for this one. Thanks for listening. Until next time, be nice, be thankful, and do the work.